My talk is called The Real AI Race, Disinformation in the Taiwanese Election. I am Martin. I have a last name that's too tremendous to pronounce. I'm a PhD candidate at Sci-Staperovich Institute. And the agenda of this talk has 4 parts. The first is called The Dunces of Davos and looks at why I'm looking at AI disinformation in the first place. The second is called Day X and is about the Taiwanese example. And it's fun because you don't know if I'm talking about the invasion or the election. Then there's a part called A Small Subsidy of $1 billion. And I finish with a part called It's the Billionaires, Stupid. AI disinformation, fear or future. I say Dunces of Davos because the World Economic Forum that is held at Davos declared AI disinformation to be the biggest short-term threat in a report at the beginning of this year. So when people talk about the AI race, what we usually mean is a race between applications that we consider to be good and applications that we consider to be bad. And that is even the case when we talk about races between countries, where our adversaries are developing AI applications for purposes that we would consider harmful, and we're developing applications for purposes we consider to be good. Now, the World Economic Forum considers disinformation to be the threat that AI is about to level at us. And I read these reports out of interest, not because they're necessarily super well written or super well grounded, but rather because they tell you what the rich people are thinking about. Specifically people who pay about $200,000 for a ticket to a 2-day conference. So it's a thing worth examining. It's a thing worth examining for a political scientist because we need to get funding. But in my case, I was a bit evil, so I didn't examine a research question based on their assumptions. I was like, are they right? Is their assumption a good one? So when we talk about AI disinformation, it's helpful to break it down into the categories of content that AI can generate, because there's vast differences between. And so this pyramid is how I see it, where text is at the bottom, followed by audio, picture, and video. And as we go up the pyramid, 3 things happen. First, the average impact of a piece of disinformation increases. Why? Because there's a lot of studies that show seeing is believing, right? When we see a video of a candidate doing something, we're much more likely to believe it than a picture or an audio or just text, which is just a rumor. Then the difficulty to generate increases. So text disinformation is super easy to do. You just run Llama locally and you have your disinformation right there. I can get it to say basically anything about anyone. But if I want to generate fake audio, that's more difficult. I need specialized software. Then pictures are more difficult, and videos, which is including deepfakes and fully synthetic videos, is sort of the crowning discipline. But as these get more difficult to generate, they also leave more artifacts behind. So there is sort of a randomness of pixel. If you've ever seen a deep fake, you can see their mouth move in a little uncohesive fashion. The eyes aren't right. There's pixelation around the ears. There's artifacts that you can find. And we're actually pretty good at finding those. So academia has developed a bunch of solutions. So the ease of detection also goes up. And it's a pyramid because this is about the amounts that we see. So that is my theory about AI disinformation. So let's go apply it to a real example, which is the case of Taiwan. So I went and applied it to the most contested information space in the entire world, which is Taiwan. Why? Because China really, really cares about it. It cares about it for their stated intention to reunite with Taiwan, basically annex it, and they have the stated intention to do that with force if necessary, but the amount of resources that will require and the consequences of a decision to do that with force are just enormous. So if they can get the people of Taiwan to get closer to a reunification, closer to being annexed by China through disinformation, they will. And they have time and time said this in all their strategic documents, in the PLA, military information warfare doctrine, and in Xi Jinping, all the way up to Xi Jinping's speeches, they said that they would do this. So you can bet that if Taiwan is having an election, China is watching. And we don't even have to bet. That wonderful happy man there is Wang Huning, who is called Xi's brain. So if you ever wondered how horrifying the inside of Xi Jinping is, there you go. Who is his most important advisor and who Xi made head of the Central Leading Group for Taiwan Affairs, which is in charge of the Taiwan Affairs Office. That's the logo right there. And which held a meeting in the run-up to the election where they brought together the grants of the Chinese government to coordinate a disinformation operation to coordinate like the plethora of disinformation operations, because really the Chinese government has built a large bureaucracy around affecting this and about putting out that disinformation. And so they held a meeting that got leaked to Taiwanese intelligence about getting Taiwan to make the right choice. And so I thought, okay, this is probably most important election to China, at least in the beginning of this year. We'll see about the end. And so I went looking into Taiwan's digital media ecosystem by scraping about 2 million posts of their version of Twitter, which is called Line, and then also their version of Reddit and the affiliated video links and pictures. And did we find disinformation, AI-generated disinformation? Absolutely. I mean, that right there are some wonderful examples from left to right. It's a deep fake of one of the main presidential candidates supporting opposition parties. Right next to him is a deep fake of a member of the House Armed Services Committee announcing that the US would send troops to Taiwan in the case of one party winning. Then to the right of him is an artificial news anchor generated by a Chinese channel and spread throughout like WeChat, targeting WeChat, and this. I don't know how well you can see him on the screen up there, but this picture just lives in my nightmares for free. And it looks so weird. And then below is a picture from an AI video about Myanmar. And I know what you're thinking. Yes, that video is obviously fake. I mean, those tanks and those troops don't look real at all. But it's also the news anchor that is fake. And maybe that you wouldn't have spotted immediately. But all of these were relatively easy to find because they have exactly the types of artifacts that I was talking about and because we have pretty good solutions for addressing this. Picture disinformation, I didn't find any picture disinformation that was significant because cheap fakes are still so much better. So if you show somebody a picture of a house and say, oh, look, this is where this candidate grew up and this is what it tells us about him, people are still likely to believe that. Like, you don't need to generate a house. It's completely unnecessary. So the cheap fakes are still absolutely dominating that domain. But we are seeing faked audio. This is, again, another presidential candidate accuses another presidential candidate of conducting bad foreign policy and basically embezzling money. But it didn't have any impact. Same for the videos. None of it had any impact because it's very easy, and this is sort of what we see with text disinformation, where we definitely saw a lot of it. For example, this book about Tsai Ing-wen, who's the president, coming out shortly before the election, just full of lies and really rude slurs, and it's quite obviously AI-generated, and there's a lot of AI-generated content on all levels, but it's not having an impact. Why? Because it's facing a distribution problem. If you think about it, AI makes it really easy to generate content, but it's still hard to get people to look at that content. You need to get attention, you need to build up an audience, you need to do what I'm trying to do, which is, captivate, draw you in, do a good talk, It's really hard, as you can tell, I'm a little floundering. And, it's not easy for AI either. It's one of the things where human beings still dominate. So even though there is all of this AI-generated disinformation, it's not necessarily super useful. But there is one part of the media ecosystem that doesn't have a distribution problem. Established brands, right? There are newspapers that already have a readership, television that already has a viewership, radio that already has a listenership. These established brands already have done the work, right? So if you can get your disinformation in there, it's much more likely to be impactful. So I broadened my scope. And when you broaden your scope, you can go too wide, which is what I did at the beginning. And there's just so many avenues that the Chinese tried in order to influence this election. I mean, we're talking launching a rocket over Taiwan. We're talking launching spy balloons. We're talking just constant air incursions into Taiwan's air defense zone, which that patch there is the one worn by the Taiwanese jet pilots who have to scramble every single day, oftentimes multiple times a day, in order to respond to, to air incursions into the defense zone. And so you have so much Chinese propaganda coming at you, it's hard to see what matters. But I realized that there's sort of a problem with that, because the field of AI, the field of disinformation, sort of has a problem of focusing on the new shiny thing, which in this case was AI, and focusing on the things that are easy to measure. So text disinformation is king. If you can find 250 Russian posts in the US election, you're definitely getting a slot in some newspaper to write about it, right? In Germany, we have this case right now where completely ineffectual disinformation was found and everybody's up in arms, right? But it's easy to find. Text disinformation is really easy to find because you can just scrape it and then you analyze it. What is much harder and basically uncovered is disinformation on the airwaves. That's what I decided to look at. I decided to look at television disinformation on television stations and actually use AI for that purpose. Because when you analyze television footage, what you have to do is collect it, store it, and then in order to get it to be analyzable, you have to transcribe it, or you have to run some analysis on the pictures within it. But usually, at least in my case, you transcribe it, and then you do the normal analyses that you would, right? But it's much more harder because there's an extra step that is computational, and that until like last year, only very few companies on the market did, and that's actually pretty expensive. But now, thanks to, not everybody's a big fan, but OpenAI released an open weight model called Whisper that anybody can download and anybody can run, and that is actually pretty good at transcribing high resource languages like English or Chinese. So what I could do is gather all this Taiwanese television footage and transcribe it on my own GPUs. So that's what I did, collecting around 170,000 news episodes of news shows across multiple channels, which comes out to about 70,000 hours of television and about 12 terabytes that I then transcribed over a multi-month process, torturing my poor 4090. And then using open source systems after the transcription was done to split it into sentences, so to add punctuation, and then to add spaces, which in Chinese is a little more difficult because characters can either stand alone or they can form words. And so you sort of have to guess based on the context which it is. But again, there's so many great systems, open sourced, that make the space visible that wasn't visible before. So a little primer on the Taiwanese media ecosystem right now. It's basically segmented. There's currently, either you're with the Greens, which is the pro-independence party, also called the DPP, or you're with the Blues, which is the Kuomintang, which is it's a nationalist party that is much more friendly to Beijing, and that Beijing gets along with a lot better. And so on the one side, you have some outlets that support the Greens, and that are pretty partisan, and on the other side, you have outlets that support the Blues that are also pretty partisan. And you can actually tell what people watch by asking them a few questions. Like if you ask somebody, hey, like how is the crime in Taiwan? And they say, oh my God, it's terrible, somebody's getting killed every single day. Highly likely they're a KMT, so a nationalist voter, and they are watching the channels controlled by the nationalists. If you ask somebody, what's the biggest problem that Taiwan is facing right now? And they say, oh, we must get independence. Likely they're a Green voter who's watching the Green channels. So again, Green Party, DPP, pro-independence, Blue Party, KMT, closer to China, nationalist sentiment. And then you have two channels in the middle, TVBS and EBC, that are going to be really interesting. But it wasn't always this way. So let me tell you a little tale of two news outlets. One is called CTI, and one is called CTV. And what they both have in common is they started out pretty friendly to the KMT. They started out light blue, but then they were both acquired. In 2002, CTI was acquired by the Want Group, and in 2006, CTV was acquired by the Want Group. Now, the Want Group is a rice cake and juice maker. So the natural expansion play, after you went from rice cake to also making juice, is buying television outlets, whose factories are all in China, whose market is all in China, and which is owned and run by Tsai Ing-wen, who's one of Taiwan's richest people. But again, most of his assets are in China, and a very strong and vocal supporter of reunification. He's literally said it's going to happen one way or the other. And he's one of the most famous Taisheng, which is sort of Taiwanese businessmen who make all their money in China and who have all their assets in China. And in the years that, after they acquired CTI and CTV, their companies in China got some little subsidies to the tune of about $600 million US at the low end to $1 billion. Those are the estimates. Somewhere in between 600 million and $1 billion is what they got in subsidies by the CCP-controlled Chinese government. Little fun fact about CTI. CTI, after its takeover, became so partisan and spread so much open disinformation that it lost its broadcasting license and is no longer allowed on the airwaves in Taiwan. But they made a massive investment to turn it into the #1 Taiwanese news show on YouTube. So it's still running strong. It still has millions of viewers on YouTube. So ownership affects coverage. What you have here is basically a computed measure of sentiment and the propensity for coverage on different topics before and after ownership. And the negative numbers are negative sentiment, and the positive numbers are positive sentiment. And what you see is that the coverage of crime, of Taiwanese identity, security, and the DPP, the Independence Party, becomes very negative, while the coverage of the Chinese mainland becomes positive, and the coverage of the KMT becomes positive. So there is some, but what increased even more is the alignment with Chinese narratives. So how do you measure Chinese narratives? Well, if you think about LLMs, we often say they just try to predict the next token in the sequence, right? So if you're trying to abstract a narrative is really just words in a certain order replicated time and time and time again. So if you were to train a model on Chinese narratives by looking at the Chinese media ecosystems and take those weights and the polarities associated with them and turn them into basically a static representation that you can pass the sort of the ordering of concepts on the Taiwanese side through, then you would be able to measure a score of agreement between the two. And that's exactly what I did, comparing the CCP narratives with the narratives of CTI and CTV, and I found that there is a 5-fold increase in sort of the alignment before and after ownership. And the base model that I used for that in the beginning was Llama 2, which is why there's Winnie the Pooh riding a llama. If you don't know, Winnie the Pooh is outlawed in China because there's a joke that Xi Jinping looks like him. So it's no longer allowed there. So yeah. But there's more. Because those two independent outlets that I was talking about before, that were sort of in between the partisan lines, also got bought. In 2016, a company controlled by a politically connected family that is on the side of the Kuomintang, the Nationalist Party, friendlier to China, tried to buy EBC, but it got rejected because at that point the Independence Party was in the presidency. So they rejected the takeover request. But then it got still sold in 2018 to a real estate group that I actually don't know that much about, except for its owner is very vocally pro-nationalist. And then on the other side, you have TVBS, Taiwan's second largest television station, which was bought through a series of silent acquisitions in 2015 and 2016 of outstanding shares, and is now fully owned by Chair Wang, the chair of the HTC consumer electronics magnate and the chip maker VIA, who's also an outspoken nationalist, and HTC again has all of its plants in China and its largest market in China and receives subsidies from the Chinese state. So did we see any change for them? Did we see the change like we saw for CTI and CTV? No, not after acquisition in 2016 and 2018, but we saw a change in this election in 2024. And the change that we saw is they didn't align more with KMT topics. They didn't talk about crime much more or suppression, which is the narrative the KMT loves. They're like, oh, you know, we're the ones who are being persecuted after they ran the military dictatorship for many years. But now they're like, we're the ones being, they didn't say that. Instead, they started talking about a very different series of issues: economy, housing, and identity. Why? Because those align with the new emergent third party that we had in this election that wasn't there before. I mean, they ran in 2020, but they didn't perform as well as they did now. And instead, we see them getting closer to this third party. And this third party gets resurgent to the point that they actually field their own presidential candidate, who still loses, but they win a proportion of seats in the House, and they undercut the traditional voters of the DPP, the Independence Party, which are younger people. So you see younger people who are worried about housing and jobs leaving this economic opportunity, leaving the DPP party where they were before and going to this new emergent third party who is now drawing their support. And so what you basically see is a restructuring of the media ecosystem where TVBS and EBC are now owned by rich people whose assets are all in China, and who are offering a third option that undercuts the traditional support, and that made it possible for a coalition of the KMT, the nationalists, and the TPP, this new third party, to get control of the parliament. And I think this is a story we missed in America quite a bit, because there was a collective sigh of relief when the DPP won the presidency. And we miss sort of the plot that they have control, that the opposition parties that we consider to be closer to China have control of parliament now. And what we're seeing is a series of fistfights. And I don't want to act like fistfights are completely unnormal for the Taiwanese parliament. It happens over there. It does, but it's much more frequent because we see a series of clashes where the KMT TPP coalition that is closer to China is trying to claim power away from the executive and towards the parliament that they control. And it's going to have an impact, especially on defense policy. And it's a reality that we should acknowledge, and that has changed the face of Taiwan to the point that it's now a completely normal thing that on a Tuesday, both lawmakers of all sides will accuse each other of starting a fist fight. And as a Taiwanese citizen, you now have to go to the Parliamentary live stream and scroll back and actually find out who started it. So that's the thing. And, fun fact, CTI may be making a comeback, because this new coalition has proposed a law that would give them a license again. Again, the station that was taken off the air because they spread so much disinformation may be coming back on the air in Taiwan, again, because they are close and helpful. So, the big picture, it's not necessarily AI disinformation. It's not always the new shiny thing. In this case, it happens to be the billionaires, stupid. I need to say as a disclaimer, of course, that aligning with China doesn't make you a Chinese asset. And I don't think that these people are Chinese assets. But I do think that if you have a lot of business dealings in a country controlled by the CCP, acting on behalf of its interests is a way to ingratiate yourself. And I think that's a reality that we have to acknowledge when we cede control of such news empires to economically connected people. I mean, it's not like a big platform in the United States got bought by a billionaire with a lot of interest in China last year. I don't know. I don't know where Tesla is made, but so that's a reality that we have to acknowledge. And I want to point out that I only talked about these three billionaire cases, but the Taishangs, so the people who are politically connected on the mainland and who have money, but are Taiwanese citizens, there's a lot more of them. To quote Kendrick Lamar, the rabbit hole is still deep. I can go further, I promise. So find me at the pool if you're interested in that, and I already went over time. So with that, I shall close. And I just want to say, I don't like this framing that the good uses of AI have to be passive and they always have to be reactive towards the bad uses. This is a case where the bad use has basically no impact, but we have an opportunity to uncover a problem that was there before, and it's made possible by open source AI. So, thank you.